Hey guys, welcome to the class. You should have already reviewed the introductory PowerPoint before you open this. It just tells you how to do everything. So if you haven't done that yet, exit out of this video and go back to that one just to make sure we're all on the same page before we start. So for those of you who have already done the introductory video, welcome again. This is going to be a completely online course, so you won't see my face unless you want to come to office hours or you need to make an appointment with me. I'm always available to you guys. So this class is a little bit different than most criminal justice classes, and it's going to introduce you to what deviance is. So first, crime and deviance are not always the same, but we will discuss that throughout the semester. And we're also going to talk about a lot of different types of deviant behavior and how they've been exhibited throughout the United States and sometimes other places as well. So the first chapter that we're going to talk about is from the Curra book, The Relativity of Deviance. So if you're not familiar with which one is which yet, this is the one with the flying pigs on the front. So this chapter starts off with telling you about one instance with Steve Irwin back in January of 2004. Most of you probably know who Steve Irwin is. If you don't know who he is a crocodile hunter. He's from Australia. He had TV shows. His daughter, Bindi, now has a TV show. But one specific thing that happened back in January of 2004 was that Steve Irwin brought his 1-month-old son, Bob, to work with him. This is a picture of that day, and I also have a video of the entire thing as well that I'll post for you on Blackboard. But obviously what you can see from here is that he is holding his 1-month-old son in one arm while feeding a crocodile in the other arm. So obviously there were a lot of people that had problems with this. They thought that it was not a good example of parenting. And there was basically public outcry from a whole bunch of different countries, Australia and the United States included in that. But to many of us, this action basically seems unimaginable. But at the same time, think about it this way. How many of us have spent a lot of time with crocodiles or rattlesnakes, or we have trained to be familiar with the Australian outback? So this is a very different scenario if you have that kind of background. So although our backgrounds are different, this does present this idea that we all disagree with one another on certain ways of acting, thinking, feeling, and being. And a lot of that is because of who we are, where we've come from, the things that we have learned along the way. So when we're looking at this one, people would want to start thinking about whose definition of this crocodile stunt would actually be considered the correct one. And really, do you think the Irwins are bad parents? Because to Steve Irwin, it was completely normal to take his infant son into a crocodile pen during a feeding. He really couldn't understand why people would think he would put his son's life in danger. So it's not really who's right. It doesn't really matter who is bad parents in this situation or who are not. What we are seeing with this event are the true elements that deviance is made of. So that includes expectations, human interactions, social evaluations, and judgments. So again, this is all the social stuff that social deviance really originates from. So what you'll learn, again, this isn't the question of who is right. It doesn't matter. We don't care about that. It's more, this is the study of deviance. It doesn't matter, again, who's right, who's wrong. So now we're going to talk about relationships and role breaking. And the study of deviance is really looking at how these things have become known as deviant. So to understand that, you have to first look at and have an understanding of the origination, so where something is coming from, and the social constructed perspective of what we refer to as the ABCs of deviance. And these ABCs are attitudes, behaviors, and conditions. The deviance of some attitude, behavior, or condition cannot be determined simply by examining it closely and objectively. There is nothing that is considered deviant by every single person. So the authors pick out a very good quote to really talk about this, and that was by Sumner, and he said that deviance is not a self-evident category. It does not just float down from the skies, applying itself to people who quite obviously are deviant. Because overall, there is no universal definition to say this particular action is deviant. And you'll definitely learn that as we continue this semester and talk about some things that are really going to make you uncomfortable with the topic most often. But it's just to display that among those people, that action is not considered deviant. One thing we also have to examine to understand deviance is culture. So the word culture was originally intended to describe the totality of behavioral, material, intellectual, and spiritual products. So essentially, all of the things that you can touch or even not touch that make your social surroundings what they are. Cultures are created by people at some time and place and transmitted from generation to generation. If individuals internalize a culture, obey its rules, and honor its values, they are usually defined by other members of that society as being responsible members of that group. So if you want to understand exactly what a culture is, just think of Mercyhurst. Mercyhurst is its own culture, and it definitely differs from other cultures like those at Gannett or Edinburgh, just because of the things that we say or do with one another, and whether it be material that we can touch, things we learn in class, or the interactions you have with one another in the hallway, they're going to be very different from students at other universities. Also, within cultures, we have smaller cultures, which we refer to as subcultures. Again, a very good example of this. At Mercyhurst, we have a smaller culture of criminal justice students. They are still members of the culture of Mercyhurst, but they're also members of the subculture of criminal justice. So this means that every other major also has their own subculture. And subcultures are often at conflict with one another. So I need to clarify that, because that does not mean that they are fighting with one another. Rather, if you're a member of one subculture and following its rules, it's often opposite of the rules of another subculture. So if you're following the rules to finish your degree in criminal justice, are those the same rules as getting your degree in fashion merchandising or even political science? So even those cultures or subcultures that seem similar to one another still have their differences as well. Another part of cultures is norms. So when we're little and we first become a part of a group or a culture, we begin learning the ways we should act, think, feel, or be. There are a ton of norms, and your book points out a couple of good examples. So chewing with your mouth open is not good, right? So the norm is to chew with your mouth closed. Or most of us are taught we wear a shirt and shoes inside of a store, right? Except for the random people at Walmart you might see occasionally. But these norms are often coupled with sanctions. And sanctions come in two types. We have positive sanctions, which convey approval and they encourage norm following activities. So that can just be something as simple as a kid does not make a mess in their room and they make their bed, so mom takes them out for ice cream. That could be a positive sanction. Or you complete all your chores for the week and you get an allowance. Again, a positive sanction. But negative sanctions convey disapproval and discourage rule breaking. So examples of negative sanction could be basically any type of crime control. So if you speed, that is against your cultural norm, and the negative sanction is that a police officer can stop you and give you a ticket. So moving on, we have this idea of centeredness. And when we talk about centeredness, what I really want you to think of is what you would put at the center of existence, right? And that's going to change from person to person. But originally, as a child, an infant, we are taught to be egocentric. So what that means is that we are at the center of our existence. The world revolves around us. And we are wrapped up in our own viewpoints. You've actually probably seen a lot of this recently on Facebook. A lot of it because of it's an election year, but also gun control and things surrounding what has recently happened in Orlando. I'm sure many of you have seen friends who think that their opinion is the best opinion and no other opinion matters. So you could consider those individuals to be egocentric. Another type of centeredness is ethnocentricity, or being ethnocentric. And this is for a group. So the group or culture believes that their ideas or beliefs are better than everyone else's. So a lot of times people will say that Americans are viewed as ethnocentric. The problem with these things is that it causes people to judge a culture who have different values, norms, customs based on their own. So instead of seeing people simply as different, they're seeing them as inferior. And I need you to get that completely out of your head for the study of deviance to really work. So something else brought up when we study deviance and especially centeredness is this idea of empathy. So people who are egocentric or ethnocentric have a hard time with empathy. They view themselves as the best. Therefore, why would they think about putting themselves in someone else's shoes, which is essentially what empathy is. Some research has started saying that empathy is controlled by certain neurons in the brain, which could mean that it has a biological or physical connection. That's not really important at this time. You can kind of move that to the side. But it's important for you to really realize that empathy is not the same thing as sympathy. So by viewing things from someone else's perspective, it does not mean that you can feel their pain. It also means that you may not even care about what happens to them if you're being empathetic. And we see a lot of this when we try and talk about racial differences, racial profiling. I know that my Justice in America classes talked about this at length, that although we can learn about the history of other cultures and other people, other races, it does not mean that we can completely understand their pain and where they're coming from. So all of this centeredness and cultures is going to lead us to the importance of relativity, which will be discussed in your next lecture.